It is a great honor to welcome up Maria, our keynote speaker. It was her grandfather who started this liturgy once again at Fort Ross. So it is embedded in her. It is in her heart and soul. And I'm so grateful that you're here with us to share these stories. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
I will quote Robin, "It is an honor and a privilege to be here and to be a speaker." In the Pastoral Journal for Holy Trinity Cathedral, 29th of October, 1922, Rector Father Vladimir Sakovich wrote, "I received a message from the mayor of Santa Rosa that members of the Native Sons have painted the outside of the old Russian church at Fort Ross, and they will maintain it as a historical monument. If I have an opportunity and the weather is favorable, on Thanksgiving Day, I intend to serve divine liturgy there. Several of our parishioners who have automobiles have responded to my proposal." While the Thanksgiving visit did not materialize, Father Vladimir did make it to the former settlement of the Russian-American Company in the following year, in May 1923. He wrote, "Visited Old Russian Church in Sonoma County. The church, built by Russian settlers, figured out. More than 100 years ago, has kept its external appearance. The government decided to preserve this historical monument of the Russian colony. Inside, it is empty, and nothing now, except the architecture, reminds you of the place where in times past, Russian people held divine services in California." No other details of this visit have survived. However, he made a return trip the next year for the 4th of July celebration that the Native Sons of the Golden West held annually at Fort Ross. He wrote afterwards, "If only the roads were safer, it would be possible to celebrate divine services there after fixing up the interior to a proper state." Today I will be speaking about those first services in the chapel since 1841, when the Russian America Company departed California. But I first want to provide a little bit of background. It all interweaves together at the end. Background about Holy Trinity Cathedral, about Archpriest Vladimir, and something about the years that followed the departure of the Russians from California. Holy Trinity Cathedral was established in 1868. Making it apparently the second oldest Russian Orthodox parish in the contiguous 48 states. Until the 1920s, the church served a multi-ethnic population. Serbs were in the majority. In the city, the Russian Orthodox Church moved from location to location with a variety of names, but both of these church buildings were named Holy Trinity. In 1918, a new priest and his family arrived from Montreal, Father Vladimir Sakovich and Matushka Maria Matveevna. For 4 years, he had ministered to his parishioners, who were primarily Ukrainians from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, often men from rural areas trying to improve their economic lives and then return home. In Canada, During these years, they faced both poverty during a recession and a hostile government during the Great War when it instituted the War Measures Act. In Montreal, while trying to alleviate these adverse conditions for his parishioners, Father Vladimir was also learning how to function in North America. He became acquainted with bureaucratic customs, legal, and social norms. When the family arrived in San Francisco, funding from Russia for the whole Orthodox missionary church operations had ceased. Father Vladimir had no salary. He confronted new problems. Some from the previous priest, unpaid taxes and mortgage on the church, disaffected parishioners, and some problems from the Bolshevik attack on the church in Russia. Unsure leadership from the North American church administration, threats from the Bolshevik government, and later the Soviet Living Church. His first reference in the Pastoral Journal to refugees from the Bolshevik Revolution and Civil War was dated July 1920. Mostly officers who told us about the horrors they endured in the homeland, he wrote. Over the next few years, the church transformed from a place of solely religious services to a help and social center, including a school, a library, a quasi-post office, and meeting space for new organizations. Father Vladimir proved to be a go-to priest. If anyone wanted to know something, it would be said, "See Father Sakovich." By mid-1924, the cathedral had become a majority Russian church. These are passport photos that I've acquired. Mostly middle and upper class and educated, these refugee emigrants came from many occupations and represented a variety of political persuasions. In this emigration, most were Orthodox Christians. They arrived with little from their previous lives. They were coping with loss of family members, livelihoods, property, country. They had fled Russia through Siberia to China. Conditions were terrible. Civil war had broken out. Brutality took place on both sides. Typhus was rampant. Finding food was difficult. Trains were often sidetracked, sometimes for weeks. Winters were harsh. The retreat of the white forces and their families across a frozen Lake Baikal took place in sub-zero temperatures. In overcrowded Harbin, some decided to try their luck in America. A few words about Settlement Ross, the southernmost outpost of the Russian-American Company in Alaska. Though numbers fluctuated, from its beginning to its final days, the population remained diverse. Census lists 1820, 21, and 1836 reveal that ethnic Russians represented only about 14% of the total inhabitants. Natives from Russia, Alaska, and California, as well as Creoles, offspring of Russian fathers and native mothers, constituted a large majority. Like most communities in Alaska, Ross did not have a resident priest. We know that a merchant clerk, Fyodor Svinin, conducted reader services until his death in 1832. 3 clerics visited Ross. Priest Alexei Sokolov, 1832, Priest Ioan Veniaminov, July and August 1836, and priest Andrei Sizik in 1841. All three were designated priests for St. Michael the Archangel in Sitka, under whose care the Ross settlement belonged. After the Russian-American Company abandoned their settlement at the end of 1841, the land and remaining structures were subsumed into the ranches of various renters and owners, all of which became thriving enterprises. The last family, George and Mercedes Call and their 9 children, owned the land for 100 years. At the turn of the 20th century, Fort Ross was a thriving dairy ranch, community hub with hotel and saloon. It also featured a shipping port. It attracted tourists. During the time of the whole ranch era, Russian buildings acquired new uses. The Rochev House, for example, was used by and expanded for 3 families before it became the Fort Ross Hotel. The chapel functioned as a barn for miscellaneous storage, including animals. A granddaughter recalled, the Russian buildings, while objects of historic interest, were not Fort Ross to us because Call and Fort Ross were synonymous. Fort Ross was the Calls, and the Calls were Fort Ross. Toward the end of the 19th century, many Californians began to be interested in the state's history, that is, the history of European Americans in California. I'm behind or ahead? There we are. A number of books and magazine articles introduced Californians to Russians and Fort Ross, as well as to Spanish missions. Much of this history was not based on fact, but imagined, manufactured, and romanticized by writers who were not historians. In the case of Settlement Ross, few had access to Russian-American Company and church records, which were, of course, written in Russian. Historically minded Californians at this time were also forming historical associations with an interest in preserving extant structures. Some of this new publicity probably inspired Russian Orthodox clerics headquartered in San Francisco to visit the old Russian settlement. Bishop Vladimir Sokolovsky of Autonomov visited in 1891, and Bishop Nikolai Zyorov in 1897. Both wanted to rescue the chapel and the cemetery, but their proposals came to nothing. It would have been very nice for us to be able to save this sacred Russian place from the hands of this Yankee, wrote Bishop Nikolai. Included in his party was Father Sebastian Dabovich, a San Francisco-born Serb, who led their prayers at the cemetery. I have 2, and I changed my mind midway. Anyhow, Father Sebastian became one of a parade, as Robin mentioned, of saints-to-be who visited either Settlement Ross or Fort Ross. When Bishop Tikhon, another saint-to-be, led a party of 5 to Fort Ross in February 1905, they too offered prayers at the cemetery. It is comforting that within the chapel at this time there is no longer the abomination of neglect. One can hope that with the sale of Fort Ross to the government of the state, which happened recently, the buildings dear to Russian hearts will be maintained. The bishop was referring to the sale of the small stockaded portion of the Call property, made possible by the efforts of the California Landmarks League and William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, the publisher of numerous newspapers, including the San Francisco Examiner, sponsored a citizens' campaign to raise money to save several historic landmarks, including Fort Ross. He subscribed $500. In July 1903, the work of the League, representing 16 organizations, and the success of Hearst's campaign allowed the purchase of several historic sites throughout the state, including part of the former Russian settlement. Mr. Call received $3,000. The Landmarks League held title to these sites until March 1906, when a state agency was created to administer them. Less than a month after Fort Ross became an official historic site, the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906 damaged the old buildings. Not until 1916-17 did restoration of the chapel take place. An important player in the story of transforming Settlement Ross into historic monument and in the initiation of the Holy Trinity Cathedral pilgrimage was the fraternal organization Native Sons of the Golden West, which took an early interest in California history and undertook activities aimed at preservation throughout the state. Its membership then was limited to men of European American background whose ancestors or ancestor arrived in California prior to its admission as a state. 2 California legislators promoted and directed finances to this early restoration of the chapel: Senator Herbert Slater and Assemblyman Hubert Scudder, both members of Native Sons. At some point after the chapel was again upright, the Sebastopol chapter of the Native Sons directed their preservation efforts toward maintaining the chapel. They formed an annual work party. They also began celebrating the American holiday, the 4th of July, at the formerly Russian Fort Ross. So closely identified with the chapel had the Sonoma County Native Sons become that for the parade celebrating the 75th anniversary of the admission of California to the United States in San Francisco, they recreated this old structure for a float. Because the formal name of the Russian Orthodox Church in North America at this time was the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church, it was common for American newspaper writers and others to call Russian churches Greek churches. I don't know why. William Borba, a prominent member of the Sebastopol chapter, recalled about 40 years later his first contact with San Francisco's Russian community. I got interested in the fact that the Russians had not been up for 100 years near this place, and I went to the Russian Orthodox Church at Green and Van Ness and got them interested in coming up and doing a service there again. On the 18th of June, 1925, Father Vladimir noted in the Pastoral Journal, "It would be good to hold a service in the first Russian church in the United States on the American civic holiday of the 4th of July. I believe that the rector, coming in contact with his needy and sometimes traumatized recently arrived parishioners, whom he was helping in very tangible ways, felt that this was an opportunity to acknowledge the past and link it to the future he saw for his compatriots in their new home. I also feel strongly that my grandfather saw his family's future in America not waiting to return to Russia when things blew over. Father Vladimir had taken out his first citizenship papers in 1922. I suspect he had by then learned that the GPU in Russia had imprisoned his brother, a deacon in the church in Siberia. Moreover, as the rector of a Russian Orthodox cathedral in North America, Father Vladimir was on the front lines of a battle against a campaign instigated by the Soviet so-called Living Church to acquire the American properties of the Russian Church. For the Sakovich family, there was no going back. So this personal assessment likely informed how he saw the future for the recently arrived refugees. Tragedy and difficulties accompanied the first 20th century church service at Fort Ross. 2 weeks beforehand, Father Vladimir asked 2 members of the church committee to help him prepare the chapel for the service on the 4th. He wrote, "We started out at 10 a.m. from Santa Rosa in 2 automobiles, A.M. Tsaragradsky and myself in the first, and V.N. Grigoriev and his wife and 3 children in the second. As we were crossing the railroad tracks near Guerneville Station, we did not see an approaching train. The first car managed to slip through, but Grigoriev's car was run over by the locomotive and smashed, injuring the owner and the children only slightly. But Mrs. Grigorieva was badly hurt, and 2 days later, as a result of her injuries, she died in the Santa Rosa Hospital, having been administered the last rites the day before." Despite the planning that had taken place with the native sons over the 2 or so weeks before the 4th, for the parishioners from Holy Trinity Cathedral, problems plagued the day. It seems that the native sons did not offer enough oversight with regard to transportation from San Francisco, and the Russians did not realize how complex the trip could be and how far away it really was on the roads and with the automobiles of 1925. Father Vladimir had been in Santa Rosa 2 days beforehand with the Reverend William Short, the Episcopal priest from the Church of the Incarnation in Santa Rosa, whom he had invited to co-serve with him in the chapel. They had visited the internationally renowned horticulturalist Luther Burbank at his home to thank him for the Shasta daisies and other flowers he had provided to decorate the chapel. My granddaughter had a very keen sense of the importance of beauty in church services. Father Vladimir returned to San Francisco on the 2nd or 3rd July to lead his group of parishioners to Fort Ross on the 4th. He wrote, "We left town at 8 in the morning in 6 taxis and a truck, about 50 people with, it's not clear, the church choir who wished to spend the holiday at the First Russian Church. The road from Guerneville runs uphill with sharp turns, and the truck, due to a broken steering wheel, never got to its destination. Some passengers took other cars, others walked the rest of the way, and it was not until 5 p.m. that we got to Fort Ross. From newspapers, we learn that originally the service in the chapel was to start at noon, but the Reverend Short held out until 2:30, hoping the travelers from San Francisco would show up. He then commenced the religious services, which one newspaper described as informal in character and somewhat in the nature of a patriotic celebration. He baptized the 2-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. George Loesch of Sebastopol giving him the name of George Leland Ross Loesch. 2 years later, the Episcopal priest would baptize their new daughter, also at Fort Ross on the 4th. The Reverend Short had to leave before the Russians arrived. On arrival, oh good, I'm coordinated, Father Vladimir wrote, "We forthwith began the procession around the church, followed by the sprinkling of holy water and a thanksgiving service. The sermon in English was about the example set by those Russian believers who built this church and their concern about spiritual life on the shores of the Pacific Ocean." A Sonoma newspaper commented, "The service was a beautiful one, and the singing of the choir a musical treat seldom heard." Reverend Sakovich lauded the courage of the pioneers who founded the settlement and cited it as an example for those of the present day. On their way back to Santa Rosa, the Reverend Short and the county tax collector, a native son, who were traveling together, stopped to help a party of Russians whose car, en route to Fort Ross, had left the road beyond Cazadero and went over the bank for 15 feet, landing upside down against a tree. Fortunately, there had been no serious injuries. The newspaper story continued. They spent more than 5 hours working to get the car back on the road. With the back wheels on the grade, the tow rope broke and the car fell 80 feet to the bottom of the canyon. With the assistance of others, the machine, badly damaged, was finally brought to the road and taken to Cazadero. Father Vladimir continues the narrative. "Because it was so late, we had to spend the night right there next to the church around several campfires. The hospitable farmers from nearby brought food. Next morning, with the remaining pilgrims, we held a liturgy, and around noon departed, leaving the church decorated with flowers and icons." I want to interject a word about Russian Orthodox singing, which was commented on by Americans at this and subsequent Fort Ross services. In 1990, I interviewed Everett Bertillon, who had married into the Call family. He and his then fiancée had been delegated to do a final cleanup of the chapel. He had a remarkable memory for that first service, including the music. They had a group of men who sang of the service at the back of the church. It was the most beautiful music I ever heard. In 1912, Americans on the East Coast had been introduced to the liturgical music of the Orthodox Church at concerts and its services at St. Nicholas Cathedral. The cathedral choir, financed by American entrepreneurial Charles Crane, inspired a revolution in American Protestant church singing. Eventually, in the 1920s, visiting choral groups to the U.S., Russian and non-Russian, further inspired what became known as an a cappella movement that took over church, university, college, and community choral groups throughout the country. Father Vladimir played an important role in introducing Americans in San Francisco and environs to this glorious music. In order to help pay off the church mortgage, he and his choir directors took the singers to Episcopal church services and to various concert venues, what I have called his musical mission. Before the first Fort Ross service, the Holy Trinity Choir had already sung in Sonoma County, twice at St. John's Episcopal Church in Petaluma. Father Vladimir had conducted a service at the Two Rock Presbyterian Church, 1923, and on the weekend before the 4th of July, the Holy Trinity Choir gave a concert at Santa Rosa's Federated Church. The beautiful Russian Orthodox singing heard at the 4th of July services at Fort Ross was not a return to the Russian settlement, but something new. In the intervening years between 1880 and 1970, an extraordinary renaissance of choral music took place in Russia, creating a new Russian choral school. And the music sung by the Holy Trinity Cathedral reflected that. As we know, the many problems of getting to Fort Ross for the first 4th of July did not preclude further services in the chapel. I think these are probably 1926, and the Reverend Short is standing beside Father Vladimir. The Press Democrat reported in March 1926 that Father Sakovich had accepted the invitation of the native sons to hold another 4th of July service in the chapel. I do not know for sure when my grandfather decided to make this an annual event, though a February 1927 letter to the Alaskan priest, Father Andrew Kashavara, claims that he had plans to hold services every 4th of July. This was likely second-hand information, but perhaps indeed true. In 1927, Bishop Alexei Panteleev served the Divine Liturgy, another first at the former Russian settlement. No bishops had ever visited. Snippets of this 1927 and the 26th service, I think, will be shown during the lunch break if people want to see it. It was captured on silent film by native son William Borba. The Santa Rosa Press Democrat reported that the outstanding feature of the service with the bishop was the singing of the male choir of Trinity Cathedral. It was estimated that more than 200 persons were present. I'm particularly fond of this photograph and even gave a talk about it some years ago. Note the two flags. I think this informal snapshot expresses Father Vladimir's understanding of the significance of celebrating a particularly American holiday at a site of Russian history for his refugee parishioners. The flags acknowledge a future in America, but also lives embedded in a Russian past. This Russian place outside of Russia had special meaning. Bishop Nikolai in 1897 had noted when he signed the guest register at the Fort Ross Hotel, "I visited this place sacred for every Russian." For refugees whose country had been drastically altered, destroyed in their eyes, the meaning of Fort Ross was especially significant. In the discovery of a Russian past in California, some found connection to an irretrievable previous life. The America to which these educated and cultured emigrants had come felt alien. Fort Ross represented something familiar, at least symbolically. I like this entry from Father Vladimir's personal diary for the 3rd of July, 1930. It demonstrates his style of diary writing, using few words but conveying a whole picture, in this case that day's trip to Fort Ross. It also portrays a smoothly running event and the integration of more locals, Americans, helping to make the pilgrimage a success. Mercedes Call, the matriarch of the Call family, who was born and grew up in Chile, often came to the July 4th chapel service and the vigil the evening before. Perhaps the Orthodox rituals reminded her of her likely Catholic background. Epilogue. In the last year of Father Vladimir's short life, attendance at the 4th of July diminished. He noted in his diary, "Not many worshipers, Russians 10, Americans, listeners and visitors. Publicity, necessary to have more written in the newspaper about Fort Ross, its historical significance." The following year, however, saw a robust turnout for this now annual event. Father Vladimir would have been pleased to read in the Press Democrat, "Sonoma County's principal celebration of the 4th of July yesterday centered around the historic grounds of Old Fort Ross, solemn high mass in the chapel, and the dedication of a new marker placed at the fort entrance were the two outstanding events of the day. The church was thronged, and many crowded outside to hear the magnificent singing of the Russian choir." These pilgrimages to Ross on the 4th of July continued in conjunction with the native sons through 1933. After this year, the native sons ceased their Fort Ross celebrations, but the Holy Trinity Cathedral visits continued through the Depression and even World War II, when gasoline and tire rationing prevailed. The post-war period saw a resurgence of participants from California's Russian communities, which included now a second wave of refugees who had settled in China and Europe after the revolution, but had become displaced because of World War II. In 1949, the new monument supervisor at Fort Ross, that is a state title, John Mackenzie, wrote to his boss, "The highlight event of historical significance at Fort Ross State Historic Monument is the annual visit of the Dean of Holy Trinity Cathedral with the choir and many of the congregation on the 4th of July. Truly, this is a special event of note in the yearly story of the state and the division of beaches and parks." He noted that there had been 552 visitors. The greater part of this number have been here to attend the services and join in the picnic which follows. In a 1954 memo, he noted that Metropolitan Leonti times his annual visit to San Francisco so as to be able to come to Fort Ross and lead the July 4th services. Russian communicants come from as far away as Denver, Seattle, San Diego, and farther to meet the Metropolitan here. He led the services through at least 1955. According to Mr. Mackenzie, the church abroad began informal services, that is, without permission, in 1949, at times not on the 4th of July, he wrote. In 1953, they received a permit to hold services on the 4th of July. There was no joint service. Holy Trinity held their service in the morning and the church abroad in the afternoon. The following year, without a permit, the church abroad appeared at Fort Ross on May 30th and held a full-fledged formal service in the chapel. Thereafter, that date, Memorial Day remained with, of course, the appropriate permissions. In my view, it was the Russianness of Fort Ross that drew the 20th century pilgrims to the site. In his 1897 article about his trip to the former Russian settlement, Bishop Nikolai noted, "I had long wanted to visit and see the place of the great cultural effort of our compatriots in this country, and also to memorialize them in my prayers at the place where they are buried." In 1905, Father Pashkovsky, later Bishop Theophilus, noted that the ancient wish of His Grace Tikhon had been to visit the historic site of Fort Ross, to pray here about the blessed memory of those who so glorified the Russian name. In the 1930s, a small group of refugees formed the Russian Historical Society in America and were educating themselves and their countrymen about the 19th century activities of their compatriots in California. They published newspaper articles as well as this booklet. Likely to the arrival after the Second World War, displaced at least twice before reaching California, found solace in the Fort Ross symbol of Russia in their new home. I think only with the Americanization of the Russian Orthodox Church, especially with the growth in the number of converts, does the importance of Ross become more Orthodox than Russian. For the early refugee emigrants, Russian identity meant being Orthodox. Culture and religion were not separate. The orthodoxy that these pilgrims professed was inextricably linked to their Russian identity. However, Father Vladimir seemed to have a somewhat different relationship with Fort Ross, something I only discovered with my recent round of research for this talk. In his obituary for Father Vladimir, California State Senator Herbert Slater, much involved with the early 4th of July visits, noted, upon the occasion of his last visit in Santa Rosa, and while on his way to Fort Ross, the deceased priest told me of the hope of the metropolitan of his church and himself that someday a little monastery might be established at Fort Ross with a corps of priests maintaining the religious rites of the historic church there all the time. This didn't happen, of course. But I think my grandfather might have been pleased, perhaps surprised, with a substitute. The pilgrims to this most recent 4th of July, the 100th anniversary, were nearly all Americans, probably mostly converts to Orthodoxy, ? At least that was my general impression. Remarkable, he might have said. Imagine all this time later. Thank you. I would love to.
Okay, welcome them in.
If anybody has questions or comments, I would welcome them. Yes.
Could you please characterize the difference between the Russian relationship to the Pomo Indians and how the Spanish had their relationship with the native people?
It's not my area of study, but I have read enough to lead me to believe that the Russians did treat the native people better in California than the Spanish. And that's held up by the after the initial contact, the better treatment of natives in Alaska by the church.
Maybe I'll add to that.
Oh, good.
Robin will probably chime in.
Yes.
Robin and I have read in some of the journals, early journals, that there were occasions when native Californians would come to the Russians at Fort Ross and ask for the Russian-American Company flag to serve as protection from the Spanish. So there is historical occasion when some of the natives have run off from the mission.
Yes, I have read, the secondary sources citing something like that, but I didn't know about the flag.
Any other questions, comments?
Igor.
Are you going to publish your grandfather's journal at some point? Thinking about it?
I want to do a biography of him and his refugee parishioners first. And I don't know if it would be such interesting reading without having lots and lots of background. Because it would be up to the church to publish the pastoral journal, and it ends in 1926 with a couple of entries. There's so much that isn't known, and his personal diaries only begin in 1929, they're, super interesting to me, but to the general reader, a list of names. And I'll just mention take the opportunity. He always mentioned who drove him that day, which I think is a sort of nice prayerful acknowledgement of the help he was getting. Yes. Oh, Ivan.
Maria, I think the biography of your grandfather is a must. Don't doubt it.
Yes.
It's a must. So my question is, did you encounter any knowledge from your research about Russian consular or former consular workers involved in any way with Fort Ross and the revival of it?
I don't. Which consular office?
Russian Empire or anybody
Ambassador?
who was
Oh.
posted
General
here?
Consul.
I have not run across that at all.
So no knowledge.
Not in these early days, and not the most recent. It wasn't consular, but it was Russian from Russia in 2010-ish, when
Yeah.
the big Renova grant. But I haven't run across anything else.
From all these years.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yes.
You mentioned something about when California history kind of became more popular, Fort Ross becoming romanticized, or the history of it. Can
Yes.
you talk more about that?
Oh, I haven't. I find it very difficult to read those articles because they are so awful. But it was the general tendency. I mean, these were newspaper writers, writers of popular works. The Overland Monthly was a big popular magazine, and they didn't have access. So the American tendency to romanticize the Russian Empire, and later when immigrants came after the revolution, contact with royalty was featured. It's that kind of, not an interest in facts, but in creating a mythology, thinking that that was necessary to make it interesting to their readers. And I think it was probably a tendency of the time, too. This is the late 19th century, early. I have a paper that I haven't read yet, but if you give me a way of reaching you, I can tell you somebody has analyzed Gertrude Atherton's work, which I can't bear reading. But she was a popular novelist, and she has written about Fort Ross. So that would be a start for you.
All right, I want to thank Maria, everyone. A round of applause.